The problems that were caused by us going off the gold standard were caused by the gold standard, and we're going to fix them by going off the gold standard even more.
Just because government is lying and is shady and it does these kinds of things doesn't mean Keynesian economics is wrong. So just because I want to just separate a few things you said, it could very well be very wrong, and they could indeed be hucksters. All of these such colorful language. I love you deeply for this. This is fun.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not like somebody like Krugman doesn't use this kind of language when discussing Austrians. It's just that when actors like him use it, it's presented as if it is legitimate because he's part of the major shows.
So the case they make and the criticism Keynesians make of Austrian economics and the case they make for Keynesian economics is it's based on empirical evidence. So Austrian economists are pie in the sky theorists about like how human nature works, and it's just all theory. And just like you said, Keynesian economics kind of sell it as a science, data-driven science. Mm-hmm. And so, where's the data, bro? On the Austrian. So one way of saying it is, how do you know if we get rid of inflation? How do you know if we get rid of central banks? If we push towards that direction, we will have a better world, a better functioning economy, better functioning markets, better functioning society.
This is another inaccurate way in which they present the economics. They present it as if it's just theory and that the data doesn't matter, but that's not the case. What the Austrians say is that without guiding theory, data is mute, data is dumb, data can't say anything. So
theory first, and then you have to have models to provide context for interpretation of the data.
And it's a sign of just how little self-awareness they have, that they think that they're just being led by the data when they're being led by Keynes's moronic theories. And they use the data to justify those theories and to stick by them. And in fact, they are the ones whose theories cannot be refuted because it's just government mandated religion. So according to Keynes's nonsense, so the way that the whole thing is, the way that they justify the inflationism is this, and I'm just using this to give an example of what you're talking about in terms of theory. The way they justify the inflationism, to tie it back to the original point, they justify that, all right, we need money to spend, and then the level of spending in the economy is what determines the state of the economy. And I've taught macroeconomics at university level for a while, so I know this. I know Keynesian nonsense better than most Keynesians know Austrians, if not all of them, I guarantee you. And so the way they see it is the level of spending in the economy is what determines the state of the economy. There's a level of output and there's a level of spending. So there's like the factories on the one side that are churning out goods, and those goods have a certain quantity and value, market value. And it's completely nonsensical, of course, because how can the value of the goods produced be different from the value of the spending? But let's put that aside for a second. So the amount of spending that happens in the economy determines the state of the economy. If the value of the production, which they call Y, is higher than the aggregate expenditure, so this is the production, and then the aggregate expenditure is lower, then we don't have enough spending to buy all the goods. And then that causes a recession. The factories start laying off workers, and then the laid off workers start spending less. And then that leads to aggregate expenditure dropping even further. And so it's a vicious cycle where the economy gets into recession. And the only way out is for Keynes's bankster buddies and government buddies to print a lot of money to give to themselves. And then that will...
That's one interpretation. To print more money to increase the expenditure, that to match the supply.
To match the level of output.
Sounds pretty good to me. I'm sold.
All right.
But even though you're saying huckster, so
yes,
I just, the way I love you very much, but like, just for people who are listening, I think I love the way you talk, and it's great and keep doing it. But just for context, like, I don't know anything that involves human nature deserves this level of certainty. At least my position is that we don't know what the hell we're doing on basically anything. And
perhaps,
but and like, there's a lot, like, certainty can get us in trouble, is my worry. I don't know much about economics. I don't even know, financial systems, monetary systems. but I just seen us get in trouble with human psychology, certainty of ideologies in general. You mentioned Marxism and so on. I came from the Soviet Union. There's a lot of people that are very certain throughout the history of the 20th century that communism is the utopia that humanity should strive for. So I'm nervous around certainty.
I could be wrong, but you ask me for my opinion.
Yes. Sorry. So it's that little bit of a caveat.
So to go back to the idea, then on the other hand, you have the level of, if the other situation is when the level of spending is higher than the amount of aggregate output.
Yes.
In that situation, you have too much spending. So therefore, what ends up happening is inflation. So according to the Keynesian worldview, this is really important because this is a way that I'm going to get to your point about empirical data and to show you why they're
not correct.
Yeah, they're not correct about what they say about empirical data. So then what this means is that there's a level of output and there's a level of aggregate expenditure. The aggregate expenditure can either be higher or lower than the output or equal to it. If it's higher, we get inflation. If it's lower, we get recessions. Okay? Mm-hmm. So is there any universe in this model? Is there any potential universe in which you can have both inflation and a recession? According to the Keynesian model, you can't, right? Because aggregate expenditure cannot be both higher and lower than output. So therefore, if you were truly being an empirical person, if you were looking at evidence and trying to analyze data, you'd look at this and say, one example, you just need one example of high inflation and high unemployment to refute this entire model, right? And of course, the world is full of examples of high inflation and high unemployment. And that's what happened in the 19th. And of course, they ignored it when it happens in poor countries because, poor countries don't really matter. But then in the 1970s, that happened in the US and in the Western economies, in the most advanced industrial economies. So historically, before then, you had all these Keynesian central bankers talking about this model and saying, well, aggregate expenditure is too low now. And that's why we have unemployment, so we need to print more money. And then they print more money, inflation goes up, but also unemployment goes up. Because this model is broken. That's not how the world works. That's not, the level of aggregate spending in the economy is not a lever with which you can control inflation and unemployment. So what would a scientist do? What would a non-huckster do in this case? Admit the theory is wrong and find another way to reformulate it. Have the Keynesians done that? No. Still the same garbage in the textbook that is being taught until today.
So is it possible to have a non-Keynesian model, but one that still supports moderate amount of inflation is good for the economy?
I mean, since the 1970s, since this has happened, yeah, this is what basically most fiat economists, as I like to call them, essentially anybody at a university financed by governments, which is financed by central banks, which is financed by
we'll
fiat.
talk about that.
Yes.
The effect of fiat money on our life, as you write about in your book, Fiat Standard. One of them is education. I'm sure we'll disagree there too. I'm not smart enough to disagree, but I'll disagree anyway.
So yeah, so a whole bunch of other models came up, but basically it's such an example of motivated reasoning. Like anybody who's got a familiarity with the scientific method or who's got an engineering background who comes into economics immediately has a lot of red flags. And I remember when I used to teach macroeconomics, I used to teach, introductory macroeconomics, and it's a course that would be taken by econ majors as well as engineers. A lot of engineers would take it as an elective. And every time I'd explain and I would just teach, the Keynesian basic stuff. And every time I'd explain it, there's always that smart engineering kid who just looks at me and says, "Sir, this doesn't make any sense because this and this and that." And I'm always like, you get it. Exactly. You're correct. Because if you have any kind of shred of scientific thinking, you see that this is all motivated reasoning. Like the answer is government needs to print money. And here's a whole bunch of models brought up by people for why government printing money is good. And the reason they're coming up to this conclusion is that you only get funded if you come up with this conclusion. If you come up with a conclusion that we need to shut down the central bank, you don't get funded by the central bank. You don't get published in the journals. You don't get a job at the prestigious universities. You don't get quoted by fiat publications like the New York Times and CNN. They don't invite you on as an expert.
Well, that's a fundamental flaw with a lot of institutions we have today, and throughout human history. Let me zoom out for just a second to the big question: what is economics? in general? What's the goal? You said there's a bunch of models. Is any economist basically trying to throw a bunch of models about human behavior on the table and try to generalize it to the global scale? So both dance between micro and macro somehow in order to determine public policy and explain the past, predict the future, prescribe policies that can control the future, those kinds of things. This is the big, basic, ridiculous question of what is economics.
Economics is the study, the way the Austrians define it, is the study of how humans make choices under the condition of scarcity. And we begin with the starting point of economics as the fact that scarcity exists. And why does scarcity exist? Well, because it's easier to want things than it is to make them. It's much easier to want a Ferrari than it is to make one. And so, because it's, we have wants and we have limited means to meet those wants, we need to economize. It's a permanent marker of the human condition. We are always economizing at all times. And so how people make those decisions under the conditions of scarcity is what economists study. So to go back to your point on empiricism in Austrian school, so it isn't that the Austrians don't believe in data. On the contrary, it's that theory has to inform data. And in fact, if you think about it, as the example of the stagflation of the 1970s shows, if you have stagflation, that just completely refutes the Keynesian model. The Austrian way of thinking, which is think from first principles, understand how the world actually works, think about how humans act, and understand that economics is really all about human action. So it's not about aggregates of goods. This is really the key distinction in terms of methodology. And for the Keynesians, it's physics envy. They look at the market economy, they look at individuals in the market economy, and they think that they can understand the market economy by looking at aggregates. This is really the key point of what I think makes the certain branch of economics pseudoscientific, is the introduction of aggregates. When you introduce those aggregates, how much production takes place, how many people are unemployed, the percentage of the inflation rate, and then you think that you can establish scientific relationship between those aggregates, it's purely physics envy. In physics, for instance, or in chemistry, you put, let's say, a container contains a gas, and you have the ideal gas law, PV equals to nRT. Calculate the pressure, calculate the volume, and then and the temperature. If you have the pressure and the volume, you can calculate the temperature because you have the nR constants. So there's a clear relationship that has been demonstrated in a laboratory, and that we can do it right now. We can measure it and we can see it, and it continues to hold. And all it takes is one scientist to show that this relationship does not hold, to do an experiment that shows that this does not hold, and it stops being a law of chemistry, and it's broken. Whereas in economics, what they've done is they've copied the superficial shape of this without any of the scientific rigor that was used to build it. There's no experiments. You can't experiment on economies. We don't have the ability to establish laws, and all the laws that we establish are just models that get people published and get them on the media to say, my model says we need to print more money, but it's never subject to actual scientific scrutiny. If it were, they would all be rejected in 15 minutes because the world is full of examples that contradict them.
Was it possible to do scientific scrutiny when it's human nature, when there's a nearly infinite number of variables and you can't control them? So what's the best thing you could possibly do?
You do thought experiments.
But the problem with thought experiments, Freud thinks everybody wants to have sex with their mother. Is he right?
That's the problem with Freud.
I don't know. Maybe he's right. Well, obviously, I'm joking on that front, but
Freud is probably another Keynes.
Well, no, I think there's power to the thought experiment. Just like Einstein, a lot of general relativity, special relativity, that's a thought experiment. It originates in a thought experiment. Now, is it true? Nice thing about physics, you can eventually have experimental validation. The downside of economics is you really can't have definitive experimental scientific rigor of validation of a theory. So a thought experiment is just a thought experiment using your intuition. It's the power of reasoning together about human nature.
And that's why economics cannot make the claims that physics can make. So with physics, you can predict that if you get this gas at this pressure, at this volume, the temperature will be that much. And you can make that prediction and test it a million times, and you'll always get the precisely correct answer. With economics, we can't make quantitative predictions.
On Twitter, and even today, you're very certain about the statements you're making. Do you?
Yeah, but I don't make quantitatively certain statements. That's the thing. In economics, we don't make quantitative predictions. We cannot do that because we don't have experiments. But we can understand how the world actually works with humility. This is really the key difference, that the Keynesians think they just want to copy the methods of physics, and then that's just, going to give them the certainty of the results of physics, which is like me saying I'm just going to put a red blanket on my back and jump from the 4th floor because I'm Superman. Well, it's not the red blanket that's going to make me Superman. There's a lot more to it.
So humility manifests itself in economics as the belief in a free market. Meaning, like, I can't do centralized control on this thing. We're going to minimize the friction of the free exchange of goods. So Austrian economics puts priority in the market.
Yes, and you could arrive at it through two paths. The more practical path, which most scientific-minded people arrive at. I came from an engineering background, so I initially had this idea that what is lacking in economics is mathematicization. We need to have better math models. We need to get all of those tools from engineering, apply them to economics, and then we'll be able to plan the world economy and make it work better. And then you start actually trying to solve problems, trying to actually calculate them, and you realize nobody can have that ability, because the difference ultimately comes down to the fact we can't have experiments. And the reason we can't have experiments is that you can experiment on particles of a gas. You can't experiment on human beings, on entire economies. And because particles of a gas are just dumb matter. And so, you kick matter in a certain way, you can calculate exactly how much is going to fly.